in starting and waging a war. It is not right that matters but victory. Nazi invasion of Poland, 1939 to 1945. Britain and France want to ensure Germany is incapable of starting another war. The Treaty of Versailles sets tight limits on German armaments and armed forces. With economic depression crippling Germany, Adolf Hitler grows in popularity. Hitler's government rebuilds Germany's military and promotes extreme nationalism. German forces invade Poland. Britain and France declare war on Germany, leading to World War II, the most destructive conflict in history. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, also secretly agreeing to invade and then divide Poland between them. Russian leader Joseph Stalin had decided that in the event of war, Germany offered the best hope of Soviet security. 1 week later, on September 1, 1939, more than 1 million German troops invaded Poland from the west. Soon after, on September 17, Russian troops attacked Poland from the east. The context for this unprovoked assault, as declared by the German Führer, Adolf Hitler, was the pursuit of Lebensraum, living space deemed necessary for the expansion of the German people, whom Hitler saw as a superior Aryan master race, with the right to displace inferior races. The invasion lasted just over a month. Trapped between two huge, well-armed powers, the Polish Air Force and Army fought valiantly, but they lacked modern aircrafts and tanks. The German Luftwaffe was quickly able to gain command of the skies. In the end, Poland's aviators and soldiers, fighting on two fronts, were overwhelmed. The invasion ended in a resounding victory, and it added to Hitler's increasing belief that he was a military genius. Some areas in western Poland were absorbed into Germany, while territory east of the River Bug was annexed by the Soviet Union. The Nazi regime in Poland. The Nazis imposed a brutal regime on the German part of Poland. Hitler was bent on the elimination of anyone who stood in the way of German domination. As part of Hitler's plan for ethnic cleansing, around 5 million Polish Jews were rounded up and herded into ghettos. The invasion of Poland gave some forewarning of the violence that it would soon be visited upon scores of countries and countless people around the globe. The rise of the Nazi Party. Although World War II was triggered by Hitler's invasion of Poland, its origins can be traced back to Germany's defeat in World War I and the demand for reparation payments. The defeated nations lost land and prestige, causing deep resentment. Germany was forced to return Alsace and Lorraine to France, and all of its overseas colonies were annexed by the Allies. Germany's Weimar Republic began its economic recovery in the 1920s, but it could not survive the blow that was inflicted by the U.S. economic crash of 1929. This financial crisis aided the rise of the National Socialist, Nazi, Party, led by Hitler, who promised the German people he would make the nation great again. Hitler had fought in World War I, and the experience of trench warfare, the shock of defeat, and the terms of the Versailles Treaty were to influence the rest of his life. He developed extremist views based on far-right nationalism, and by the time he became Chancellor of Germany's coalition government in 1933, and dictator of the country the next year, he ruthlessly pursued his policies of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. Hitler's Lebensraum. Under this creed, Hitler embarked on an ambitious foreign policy. In 1935, openly going against the terms of the Versailles Treaty, he began a massive program of rearmament. In 1936 he occupied the demilitarized Rhineland, but none of the major powers intervened. In March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria to Germany, before setting his sights on the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. British and French politicians wanted to avoid a repeat of the horrors of World War I and felt that the Sudetenland was not worth fighting for. In the Munich Agreement of September 29, 1938, the Sudetenland was handed to Hitler in exchange for his promise to end his land grabs. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared that he had secured peace for our time, only for the Nazis to invade the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Fascism in Europe. Italy's fascist dictator Benito Mussolini also had aspirations for foreign glory. In October 1935, he invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia, in retaliation for the defeat the Italians had suffered there in 1896. By May 1936, Mussolini had conquered the country, facing no opposition from the Western powers. Further evidence of Western democracy's weakness in facing up to the fascist challenge was provided the same year, when both Mussolini and Hitler sent volunteers to fight in the Spanish Civil War, to aid nationalist General Franco in his campaign against left-wing supporters of the Spanish Republic. Britain and France took no action, and Franco's victory in 1939 bolstered the fascist cause. The West intervenes. Hitler's invasion of Poland, which began on September 1, 1939, finally forced Britain and France into a war they had been trying desperately to avoid. Deciding that they needed to take a tougher stance against Hitler after his takeover of Czechoslovakia, the two nations had guaranteed Poland support in the event of German aggression. Honoring this promise, they declared war on Germany on September 3, which meant British and French colonies were also drawn into conflict. Britain's dominions Australia and New Zealand declared war immediately. The Union of South Africa followed on September 6, and Canada on September 10. Germany quickly overran Poland with its tactic of blitzkrieg, lightning war, which utilized tank divisions supported by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The British sent an expeditionary force, BEF, to France, but neither Britain nor France attempted an offensive against Germany. They were not ready for a large-scale attack, and some politicians still believed that peace terms could be negotiated. This period became known as the Phony War. Expecting to be bombed, Britain began to evacuate its children from major cities. Air raid shelters were built, and gas masks handed out. The Phony War ended in April 1940, when Germany attacked and conquered Denmark and Norway. A month later, they turned on France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The French army was poorly led and badly equipped. France had relied on the Maginot Line, a chain of fortresses along the frontier with Germany, to halt any attack. But the fortification did not extend along the Franco-Belgian border, and the Germans simply bypassed it at the north end. Within the space of 6 weeks, France had fallen to the German onslaught. The Battle of Britain. Only a hesitation by Hitler, who may have wanted to rest his troops and spare them from a possible counterattack, prevented the destruction of British forces before they could be evacuated by sea from Dunkirk. Thousands of Allied soldiers were transferred across the Channel in all kinds of vessels in Operation Dynamo. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty and later Britain's wartime Prime Minister, told the British Parliament, "The Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin." However, Hitler's attempt to invade Britain in Operation Sea Lion had to be abandoned after the Luftwaffe failed to win the Battle of the Skies. With the Luftwaffe triumphant in both Poland and France, the Germans had hoped that Britain could be beaten by air power alone. However, German crews were exhausted, intelligence was poor, and Britain's use of radar enabled the Royal Air Force, RAF, to track incoming planes and take off in time to meet an attack. The Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 was the first real check on Hitler's progress, but Britain alone could not fight a power that now had control of almost the entire continent. The world at war. What started as a European war gradually became a world war. In June 1940, Italy, emboldened by German successes, declared war on Britain and France, fulfilling the terms of the Axis Agreement made between Hitler and Mussolini on May 22, 1939. But Italy's failures in Greece and North Africa forced Hitler to send German armies into these areas, as well as Yugoslavia. On September 7, 1940, Germany began its first major air raid on London. The Blitz, as the bombing of the English capital became known, thrust civilians into the war and put relentless pressure on industry, ports, and British morale. With men joining the army, women were required to work in factories and on farms. Food rationing was introduced in Britain in January 1940, and people were urged to grow their own food. Nazi-occupied Europe also experienced food shortages, which weighed most heavily on the conquered populations. Collaboration or exile. In some locations, the Germans worked with existing governments and fully supported puppet administrations, such as the pro-Nazi Vidkunquisling in Norway and the Vichy regime in southern France. Led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, Vichy was officially neutral, but it collaborated closely with Germany, fighting the French resistance, and implementing anti-Semitic legislation. Germany had total control in Poland and eventual control of the Baltic states. Monarchs and politicians of more than a dozen occupied countries escaped to Britain. Polish ministers set up headquarters in London, and Belgium's government operations were transferred there. The Dutch royal family, under Queen Wilhelmina, also sought refuge in London. When France fell to Germany, Charles de Gaulle, who opposed the newly installed Vichy government, became the voice of French opposition to the Nazi occupation. In 1940, the biggest threat facing Britain was from German U-boats. As an island, Britain was dependent on its merchant ships to bring in vital supplies but also to export equipment to its fighting forces abroad, and German U-boats were sinking dozens of Allied ships each month. Merchant ships traveled in convoy to increase the chances of supplies getting through on each journey, but casualties were high. Fighting the USSR. In June 1941, Britain gained a new ally when Germany invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa. Hitler had looked to the Soviet Union for new territory for the German people. It would also remove any future threat from the East, but fundamentally followed through on Hitler's plan to destroy communism. At first it looked as if Germany and its allies would be as successful against the Russians as it had been against the French. By winter, Germany had advanced within 1 mile, 1.5 kilometers, of Moscow, and Leningrad, the USSR's second city, was under siege. Another powerful rationale for war in the East was one based on racist ideology and Hitler's hatred of Slavs and Jews. As German troops swept into Russia, they inflicted a terrible campaign of genocide against communists and Jews. Russian troops endured extreme hardships. German tanks plowed through the Red Army defenses. Prisoners of war were shot or left to starve. Fleeing civilians were butchered without a moment's hesitation. The harshness of the Russian winter slowed the Germans, and Russian counterattacks drove back their front line by several hundred miles. In the Battle of Moscow, from early October 1941 to January 1942, an estimated 650,000 soldiers from the Soviet army lost their lives. In the spring of 1942, the Germans resumed their offensive in the USSR, driving the Red Army back and coming close to taking the Russian oil fields. The Pacific and Africa. In December 1941, Japan entered the war by attacking the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, in the Hawaiian Islands, as part of its plan to drive American forces out of the Pacific. Germany, which had a tripartite agreement with Japan and Italy to provide mutual military assistance in the event any one of them was attacked by a nation not already involved in the war, immediately declared war on the United States. Britain now had two strong allies, the USSR under Joseph Stalin, and the US, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Both were decisive in bringing about the defeat of the Axis powers. American industry became a triumph of wartime production, giving Americans in combat in Europe and Asia the tools they needed to fight the Axis. Japan won quick victories in the Pacific. It successfully captured the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, and Singapore, Britain's main naval base in East Asia. In North Africa, meanwhile, a renewed Axis offensive led by General Erwin Rommel brought the German and Italian armies within striking distance of Cairo and the Suez Canal. The first major Allied victory came in Egypt. In July 1942, Rommel was halted at El Alamein. In October, he was forced into retreat by the British Eighth Army, led by Field Marshal Montgomery. That same winter, the Red Army defeated the Nazis at Stalingrad. The Soviets encircled the Germans, forcing a surrender in February 1943. The turn of the tide. In a conference at Tehran in November 1943, the Allied leaders agreed on a strategy to liberate Europe, while the Russians drove the Germans back in the east, and the British and Americans advanced slowly through Italy. A huge Allied invasion force arrived in Normandy in June 1944. 11 months later, it had reached the River Elbe in northern Germany, while Russian troops were advancing block by block through Berlin. Germany was being hit repeatedly by British Lancaster bomber aircraft from Bomber Command and the US 8th Air Force. Staring at defeat, Hitler committed suicide on April 30, and Germany surrendered unconditionally a week later. The last act of the war came in August 1945, when the US, after fighting island by island through the Pacific, put an end to Japanese resistance by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The effects of the bombs were cataclysmic, inflicting unprecedented horror on the two Japanese cities. Nations united. Hitler's invasion of Poland marked the start of World War II, the largest and the most destructive war in history, by the end of which an estimated 60 million people had been killed. Like their predecessors in 1918, the Allies were determined that this should be the last war of its kind. Representatives of 50 nations met in 1945 to set up the United Nations. There was hope that this would mark the start of a new era of international understanding. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. American planes dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Japan to surrender and end World War II. On August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. The inhabitants below had no idea what was about to happen. People, animals, and buildings were incinerated in the searing heat. Some 70,000 died immediately. Despite this terrible event, Japan did not surrender. Japan had cause to reconsider its position when the Soviets centered the war against them by crossing into Manchuria on August 9. When, that same afternoon, the US dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki, instantly killing 50,000, Japan was brought to its knees and agreed to the Allies' terms of surrender. These unprecedented attacks avoided a bloody ground assault by the Allies on the Japanese mainland, but many thousands lost their lives as a result of the long-term effects of radiation sickness. German troops crossed the Polish frontier this morning at dawn and are since reported to be bombing open towns. In these circumstances there is only one course open to us. Neville Chamberlain. We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender. Winston Churchill. History knows no greater display of courage than that shown by the people of the Soviet Union. Henry L. Stimson, U.S. Secretary of War. In context. Focus. World War II. Before 1919, the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I humiliates Germany and sows the seeds for future conflict. 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, is founded. 1933, the Enabling Act gives Adolf Hitler dictatorial power in Germany. After 1942-43, the Soviets defeat the Germans at Stalingrad. 1944, the June 6 D-Day landings, which were the largest amphibious military operation in history, begin the liberation of Western Europe. 1945, as Russian troops win the Battle of Berlin, Hitler commits suicide. The Germans surrender unconditionally. Declarations of war against Germany began right after the invasion of Poland and carried on until the end of World War II. Some nations, such as those asterisked, switched sides late in the conflict. Canada, September 10, 1939, USA December 8, 1941, Mexico May 22, 1942, UK September 3, 1939, Finland April 3, 1945, Netherlands December 8, 1941, France September 3, 1939, Italy October 13, 1943, Nicaragua December 8, 1941, Turkey February 23, 1945, Egypt February 24, 1945, Brazil August 22, 1942, South Africa September 6, 1939, China December 8, 1941, Australia September 3, 1939.